Hey guys, tonight we're venturing into the shadowy candlelit corners of early colonial bedrooms. Yeah, Puritan ones. You might be picturing stiff collars, soul-crushing guilt, and an utter banishment of anything vaguely sensual. But here's the kicker. Puritans were not nearly as prudish as we make them out to be. They might have gone hard at church, but they also went, well, pretty hard at home. And you probably won't survive this little history lesson with your current assumptions intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. You love seeing how far this sleepy little rabbit hole reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together. You're a newlywed in 17th century Massachusetts Bay Colony. You've just endured the awkward, overly intense wedding sermon. Your neighbors watched your every move during the reception. And now it's finally time for the main event, repression. Because unlike modern couples who get whispered jokes and gift cards, you've got the entire theological weight of the community pushing you toward the bedroom. Yes. Sex is not only expected on your wedding night, it's your duty. And here's where things get spicy. Despite the heavy sermons and hellfire warnings, Puritans believed that marital sex was one of God's most direct blessings. It wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated, within the bounds of matrimony, viewed as something good, even holy. That doesn't mean it was candlelit roses and whispered sweet nothings. It also wasn't cold avoidance. Ministers preached from the pulpit that spouses owed each other regular sex. Some citing 1 Corinthians like it was a to-do list. Husbands were told to love their wives, not just with provision and prayer, but with flesh and blood affection. And wives, they weren't just expected to lie back and think of new. They were expected to participate, to enjoy, and to want. Imagine the shock if you could walk into one of those sparse little homes on a frostbitten, colonial night and find a couple snuggled beneath their woolen blankets, whispering softly, maybe even giggling. These weren't sterile partnerships for procreation. These were real marriages, full of humanity and surprisingly tender. The sheets were rough, the fire dim, but the heat was there, historically speaking. Puritans lived in tightly packed communities, with even tighter behavioral codes. But that didn't mean their emotions, urges, or longing for closeness vanished. In fact, because life was so short, so harsh, and so fragile, intimacy mattered more, not less. You could be dead from smallpox in a week. Your baby might not survive the winter. So that moment in bed with your spouse, that was survival, comfort, maybe even grace. Here's a curious fact for you. In the early colonial records, there's case after case of men and women suing their spouses for denying them sex. Not because they were cruel or spiteful, though sometimes sure, but because denying intimacy was literally breaking the covenant of marriage. That's how deeply this was baked into Puritan life. They believed that a healthy marriage included regular sexual connection. And if that wasn't happening, something was wrong morally, spiritually, and legally. Of course, this wasn't a sex-positive utopia. There was guilt, there were restrictions, and oh boy, was there surveillance. The so many burrs who smiled at your wedding might be reporting to the minister if your chimney fire burned low 2 nights in a row. That fire wasn't just warmth, it was a sign you were fulfilling your obligations. Weird, right? But else, in a world where privacy was a luxury and survival a daily struggle, your bedroom behavior was community business. Even more bizarre, ministers didn't shy away from addressing it. Sermons might veer directly into the territory of marital intimacy, and some writings from Puritan theologians read like borderline self-help guides for mutual satisfaction. Theologian William Googe, great name, right? Wrote openly about how sex was due from one spouse to another. And if that due benevolence wasn't provided, it could open the door to temptation and sin, a risk to both souls. Now, scholars still debate just how deeply this ideology ran. Were all Puritans deeply comfortable in their sexuality within marriage? Or was this a deal more theory than reality? There's evidence for both. Some diaries are full of affection and longing. Others mention repression, and the classic lay still like a dead fish approach. It's the contrast that's most human and most compelling. On the fringe side of things, there were whispered stories of more unorthodox behavior. Bundling, for example, a practice we'll get into soon, involved potential couples sharing a bed, with clothes on, sometimes separated by a board, allegedly. But that's just 80. The point is, Puritans weren't uniformly cold and joyless. They were complex, contradictory, and very, very aware of what happened under the covers. So, tonight, as you drift off, think of a world where sex wasn't shameful, but sacred, where a failing sex life could bring legal trouble, where love and duty danced awkwardly under handmade quilts. You, in your itchy linen nightshirt, huddled beside your spouse in a creek hide, dead, trying to fulfill not just your earthly promises, but your spiritual ones too. The thing is, once you were married in Puritan New England, the signal wasn't just a subtle green light. It was more like a clanging church bell and a marching band saying, "Go forth and multiply already." The societal expectation wasn't just that you'd consummate the marriage. It was that you'd keep consummating it over and over, preferably, resulting in a string of children spaced about 18 months apart like clockwork. A marriage without sex wasn't a valid marriage, period. And this wasn't whispered behind closed doors. It was front and center in legal documents, sermons, and household expectations. You wake up a few days after your wedding, still adjusting, toes leaping, beside someone else, and already your neighbor has commented on how wealthy you both look. This is a coded way of asking if the marriage bed has been, shall we say, active, and it's not meant to be invasive. Okay, maybe a little, but it's also part of a genuine belief that a good marriage is a physical one, a couple that doesn't sleep together in every sense of the word isn't just being weird. They defying God's plan, and in Puritan terms, defying God's plan could lead to all kinds of very bad things. There's Adam you keep hearing from both church elders and friendly old ladies, handing you overripe pears. Do benevolence. That's the biblical phrase cited most often to describe a spouse's obligation to give themselves to the other. It's basically sex, sanctified and scheduled. It's not about passion for its own sake, although it can be passionate. It's about service, kindness, and frankly, spiritual duty. You're supposed to want each other, and if you don't, something needs fixing fast. Some couples took this duty extremely seriously in personal letters and journals. Some surprisingly tender, others accidentally hilarious. Puritans wrote about longing for their partner's touch, missing the warmth of their body at night, or worrying that their affection was cooling. And we're not talking about steamy bodice repression. This is pure heartfelt, 1600s honesty. One miss, thy arms and thy breath at my back. It's a kind of romantic sincerity that's so awkward, it's endearing. Here's something you probably weren't expecting. Refusing sex in a marriage could actually get you hauled before a court. Not just a church tribunal, an actual colonial civil court. If a husband or wife wasn't living up to their conjugal duty, the other could file a complaint. And those complaints weren't always just symbolic. They were investigated, documented, and sometimes lead to fines, counseling, or in rare cases, even annulment. The colonial leadership understood sex not only as an emotional or moral issue, but as a structural necessity. A society without stable affectionate marriages, and thus without regular intimacy, was a society heading for collapse. One of the most surprising cases comes out of Plymouth Colony, where a woman named Sarah filed a complaint against her husband for withholding sex. That's right, she sued him, and the magistrates took her claims seriously, questioning the husband's behavior, motivations, and even, this is real, his sleeping habits. Eventually, he was reprimanded and told to fulfill his duty to his wife or face more serious consequences. You can almost hear the unspoken community chorus. Just do it, man. But of course, not every marriage was ideal. There were a plenty of cold beds, awkward encounters, and quiet resentments. In some cases, religious beliefs did clash with bodily needs. A person might feel ashamed of their desires, or might see pleasure itself as dangerous. That's where the theological rubber hit the wall. Covered mattress. Puritans were constantly negotiating between spirituality and human longing. Was it okay to enjoy it too much? Could lust exist within marriage? Did thinking too much about your spouse's body mean your soul was slipping? These weren't abstract debates. They played out in real bedrooms across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. A husband who seemed too forward might be accused of putting flesh before faith. A wife who appeared too disinterested might be seen as spiritually deficient or rebellious, and those questions didn't have easy answers, even among the clergy. That's the open scholarly debate right here. How seriously did Puritans wrestle with the pleasure versus duty equation? Some historians argue they were repressing all but the bare minimum needed to populate the colony. Others suggest a more nuanced view, that within marriage, they embrace pleasure as duty, finding harmony between bodily joy and godly purpose. The written records don't give a single answer. They give contradictions, layers, and the occasional poetic sigh about the warmth of her hand upon the linen. On the fringe side of things, there were certainly couples who either couldn't or wouldn't meet expectations. That's where things got sticky. In a society that valued conformity, sexual dysfunction, or coldness wasn't just a personal problem. It was a and while we might laugh today at the idea of Puritan sex therapy, they did have crude versions of it. Pastoral counseling, scriptural encouragement, even group interventions. Seriously, you'd be visited by elders who wanted to talk through your marriage dynamics. Not exactly a romantic mood setter. Imagine trying to explain a low libido phase to a guy in a steeple hat, quoting Leviticus. That's your Tuesday night now. And still, despite the pressure, despite the public nature of private things, some couples thrived. They genuinely cared for each other, found joy in their connection, and left behind records that are shockingly sweet. One man wrote that his wife's presence gave him peace from crown to toe. Another woman noted that her husband's kiss was like sunshine after frost. It's romantic, in a flannel and firewood kind of way. So, as you curl under your own blanket tonight, picture the flickering light of a tallow candle, the creak of a pine bed, and two people trying to figure each other out. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and existentially, and all under the watchful eye of an entire village, a stern pastor, and a God who will parently its attendance at every nighttime encounter. Let's say it's Sunday morning in your New England village, and you're crammed into a wooden pew that's about as comfortable as a fence post. You're half listening to the sermon, half wondering if your ox yoke is going to hold through tomorrow's plowing. And then bam, the minister starts talking about sex. Not lust or sin exactly, but sex in church from the pulpit. And he's not being vague either. He's quoting scripture, naming body parts delicately, and talking about what goes on in the marriage. Bet with the same tone he uses when reading the 10 Commandments. It's sharing, surreal, and completely normal for a Puritan congregation. You glance around, no one looks shocked. In fact, a few folks nod solemnly because this is kind of frank, practical talk that Puritan ministers didn't shy away from. Sex wasn't just about personal happiness. It was a core piece of their religious worldview. It showed up in sermons, not just to warn against fornication, but to uphold the holiness of marital intimacy. Ministers would remind couples of their obligations to one another, their right to pleasure within marriage, and the danger of withholding it. And while their tone stayed formal and theological, their content got very real. One well-known minister, Increase Mather, yes, that was his actual name, once gave a series of lectures where he emphasized the marriage debt, referring to it as a God-given duty that, if neglected, could lead to spiritual decay or even demonic temptation. That's not exactly pillow talk, but in Puritan terms, it means your pastor was low-key, encouraging a healthy sex life. You didn't giggle during these sermons. You took notes because these talks had direct consequences for your household harmony, your community standing, and in their view, your eternal soul. And no, this wasn't about encouraging wild abandon. This was sex with a purpose. To bind husband and wife, to prevent straying, and to build a stable, godly home. Ministers often used the Song of Solomon, a steamy bit of Old Testament poetry, as a sacred blueprint. Of course, they framed it as a metaphor for Christ and the church, but even so, reading about cheeks like pomegranate sand lips, dripping honey had to get some wheels turning in the minds of married congregants, or at least make the sermon less boring. One curious fringe story comes from a lesser-known sermon delivered in Salem in the late 1600s. The minister preaching on Genesis spent a solid 15 minutes describing the mutual delight Adam and Eve experienced in their blessed nakedness before the fall. Parishioners later recorded being moved to reflection by the detail. Translation: he gave a tasteful Bible-backed TED Talk on how first humans got it on. This wasn't scandal. It was theology made flesh. But here's the interesting scholarly wrinkle: how much of this was truly meant to celebrate pleasure, and how much was a precautionary tale. Historians still debate this. Some argue that these sermons were more about preventing sin than promoting joy. Ministers, they say, were trying to keep people from adultery or self-abuse, Puritan code for masturbation. So, they encouraged intimacy as a preventative measure. Others believe these sermons reveal a deeper theological respect for pleasure, at least the kind that fit neatly within marriage and gender norms. The truth likely sits somewhere in the middle, part passion, part panic. Let's not forget the social context. This was a world without much privacy. Most houses had 1 or 2 rooms, and kids often slept nearby or in the same room entirely. Doors didn't lock, walls were thin, and yet, ministers expected regular intimacy. That created a tension that still resonates today. How do you create space for affection and desire in a life full of duty, surveillance, and insulation? Here's where it gets charming, though. Some ministers tried to be encouraging. They wrote pamphlets filled with practical advice emphasizing tenderness, mutual respect, and the need for patience. They reminded men not to be brutish and warned women not to be cold and withering. One even wrote that marital intimacy should be joyful without haste and not grievously imposed. That's surprisingly gentle advice from a guy who also thought witches lived in the woods. On the fringe there were rumors, just whispers really, that some ministers practiced what they preached a little too freely. A few were caught in extra scandals or found to be a little too cozy. During home visits, these cases were rare but juicy when they happened, and often led to full-blown public trials or banishments. Hypocrisy always makes a good headline, even in the 1600s. But in most cases, ministers genuinely saw themselves as caretakers of the soul and the home. Their job was to guide their flock toward righteousness. And yes, that included nudging them back under the sheets if things had cooled off. They weren't prying. Well, not always. They were protecting. That's how they saw it, anyway. So, as the sermon wraps up and the congregation files out, you and your spouse walk home in silence, cheeks red, not from embarrassment, but from the cold wind and the slow realization that your pastor just assigned you homework. Maybe later tonight, once the kids are asleep and the fire's down low, you'll remember his words. You'll lean in a little closer, brush a hand against a familiar hip, and remind each other that love, real, earthy fumbling love, isn't just, it's sacred. You hear the clatter of the latch lifting, a neighbor's knocking again. It's the third time this week someone's come by to ask how things are, settling between you and your new spouse. What they really mean is, are you two doing it yet, and regularly? Don't worry, they're not being creepy. Well, maybe a little. But this isn't just idle curiosity. In Puritan towns, the idea of conjugal rights wasn't an abstract marital perk. It was a serious, legally recognized expectation. And here's the kicker. Wives had those rights just as much as husbands did. You probably didn't expect that. We're so used to thinking of the Puritans as a hyper-patriarchal bunch who kept women silent, shoeless, and pregnant. But in reality, within marriage, women had more power than you'd assume, especially when it came to the bedroom. A wife could, and sometimes did, demand sex. Not just permission for it, but participation in it. Denying your wife intimacy wasn't just cold. It was potentially criminal. And women knew it. This wasn't feminism exactly, but it was a surprisingly forward-thinking understanding of mutual obligation. Puritan theology emphasized that marriage was a covenant, and both parties were equally bound to it. That meant emotional, spiritual, and, yes, physical commitment. The marriage debt had to be paid both ways. A husband who refused his wife's advances could find himself dragged before a court. And no, he couldn't use "I'm tired" as an excuse. Judges expected both partners to uphold their end of the sacred contract, and that included getting busy beneath the hand-stitched quilts. In one recorded case, a woman named Abigail went public with her frustrations. Her husband hadn't touched her since the wedding. No excuses, no illness, no accidents, just nothing. She testified that she felt unloved, ashamed, and spiritually vulnerable based her husband's neglect was, in her eyes, a sin of omission. The court agreed. He was chastised, fined, and told to correct his erroneous. He had a medically verifiable affliction, which basically meant, if he wasn't dying or severely maimed, he'd better show up in bed pronto. And here's a fun fringe detail. Some of these court rulings even specified a schedule. That's right. In certain settlements, courts recommended how often couples held be intimate. Every few days, ideally. They weren't leaving anything to chance or chemistry. It was marriage-a moral algorithm. You might be wondering, did women really feel empowered by this, or were they just trying to navigate a system stacked against them? That's where the scholarly debate heats up. Some historians thought these rights were largely symbolic, that, while women could file complaints, they rarely did without male backing. Others point to the growing archive of court cases and personal letters that show women speaking up with startling clarity and confidence. In many of these cases, wives aren't timid victims. They're fed-up partners, demanding what walls promised. And in everyday life, wives wielded more bedroom leverage than you'd expect. A husband who wanted to avoid scandal, and Puritans feared scandal, like toddlers fear thunder, had to keep his wife reasonably happy. That meant kindness, conversation, and conjugal attention. If he failed at any of those, she might gossip to Venibors, complain to the minister, or go straight to the courthouse with a testimonial and 3 witnesses. Nobody wanted that. Of course, all of this took place in a society where women still had limited public authority. They couldn't vote, own property in most cases, or serve in civic roles. But the bedroom was different. There, they had a kind of moral and emotional equity that's often overlooked in modern portrayals of Puritan life. Sex wasn't just something done to women. It was something expected of them and for them. And let's not forget the emotional texture behind all this. In diaries and love letters, yes, Puritan love letters, wives wrote about desiring closeness, craving their husband's affection, and missing the warmth of shared sleep. These weren't icy partnerships. They were often affectionate, sometimes passionate, and occasionally downright tender. One woman wrote that she missed her husband's voice in the dark and his weight on the bed. That's the kind of emotional honesty that floats through time and makes you blink a little harder than usual. Now, there were exceptions. Some marriages fizzled, some were outright disasters. But many Puritan couples made intimacy part of their rhythm, interwoven with chores, childering, scripture, and sickness. There was very little room for drama, so affection had to sneak in through shared work, whispered moments, and slow burning trust. Let's not romanticize it too much, though. There were still enormous pressures on both partners. A wife might have the right to sex, but she was also expected to provide it when requested, sometimes, regardless of how she felt. The line between mutual obligation and coercion was blurry, and that's a hard reality to ignore. Emotional labor, physical availability, and reproductive demands all piled up on women's shoulders, often silently. Still, in terms of 17th century standards, the Puritans were surprisingly progressive in recognizing that a healthy marriage meant both partners had needs and that those needs were valid, even sacred, not because of modern values, but because they saw the marital bed as one of God's gifts, a covenant not just of loyalty, but of love, and yes, desire. So tonight, picture this: a frostbitten night in Colonial, a fire fading low, and a couple under a mountain of patchwork quilts. The room's quiet, except for the crackle of embers, and the soft whisper of linen shifting. No seduction scripts, no mood lighting, just a mutual sense of duty that weirdly makes everything feel more tender. You reach for each other, not just because you're allowed to, but because somewhere in that tangled theology, someone thought this moment meant. You're a few months into marriage now, and while you've gotten used to the scrouchy wool sheets and that annoying draft that sneaks in under the door, there's one phrase you keep hearing, over and over again: do benevolence. It pops up in sermons, in community gossip, and even in the nosy advice from your neighbor Ruth, who has no problem telling you that your husband should be tending to your benevolence more than his oxen. And no, she doesn't mean general kindness or polite gestures. She means sex, biblical sex, regular, intentional, body and soul, affirming marital sex. According to Puritan society, it's not just your right, it's your religious obligation. Do benevolence comes straight from 1 Corinthians 3 and 4. The Puritans. It wasn't a metaphor. The idea was that spouses owed each other conjugal rights, just as much as they owed food, shelter, and emotional care. Sex was part of the package, part of the promise. It wasn't optional. It was written into the spiritual contract of marriage, and failing to provide it could land you in serious moral, and sometimes legal trouble. So when your husband comes in from the cold, snow crusting his boots and cheeks red from wind, there's more on his mind than throwing out his fingers. He's thinking about his benevolence duties. Not because he's a 17th century romantic, but deep in his Puritan mind is a little voice whispering, "Thou shalt not neglect thy spouse." It's biblical, it's expected, and honestly, it's kind of sweet, in a strict theological sort of way. This wasn't just a male-focused said command either. Wives were equally responsible. The word benevolence carried with it a sense of mutuality, an understanding that this act wasn't about dominance or submission, but about shared care. This wasn't the language of flowers and flattery. It was the language of covenant, which in Puritan logic was way sexier than anything involving lace or poetry. Interestingly, this theological idea of marital duty created some rather detailed legal outcomes. In some towns like Hartford and Plymouth, church courts actually reviewed cases where either spouse claimed the other wasn't holding up their end of the bedroom bargain, and the court wouldn't just brush it off. They'd investigate. They'd question neighbors. They might even assign mediators to counsel the couple. Imagine having a local elder try to coach you into having more and better sex, all while quoting scripture. That's not even an exaggeration. Now, was all of this based in healthy marital bonding, or was it just a moral panic in disguise? That's where the historical waters get murky. Some scholars argue that the intense focus on due benevolence was less about care, and more about control, about managing human desire through rigid structure. They point to the Puritan tendency to systematize everything from prayer schedules to milk rations, arguing that even sex was just another checkbox. Others disagree. They say Puritans recognize the power of intimacy to build stable marriages in a volatile, fragile world, that they weren't repressing sex. They were just trying to make it meaningful, sacred, even. On the weirder fringe of the system were situations where the courts got way too involved. There's a recorded case from Colonial New Haven, where a couple was interrogated because they hadn't conceived after their first year of marriage. The suspicion that they weren't fulfilling their due benevolence. The town council actually ordered them to prove their intimacy was chaperoning. They weren't asked to produce love letters or romantic gestures. They were asked for eyewitness testimonies and circumstantial evidence. Let that sink in. There was also a bizarre side effect of this mindset. Sex became, in some twisted way, communal property. Everyone had a stake in your marriage because a weak union could spell trouble for the whole settlement. If you weren't sleeping together, you weren't reproducing. If you weren't reproducing, the colony wasn't growing. And if the colony wasn't growing, Satan might have an opening. So, yes, if you weren't having sex, the devil might win. Repression. This is where things get especially surreal. Because while you and your spouse are fumbling through thick choreography of early married life, trying to carve out moments of closeness in a one-room cabin full of children, firewood, and goats, there's a theological cloud hanging above. The bed, you're not just having sex, you're contributing to the godly order of the universe. And if that doesn't take the spontaneity out of things, I don't know what will. But here's the thing. For all heavy expectations and clunky religious language, many couples found real closeness in these moments. Whether 1651, a man in Connecticut was found guilty of gross neglect of conjugal duty. He was ordered to pay a fine and told to report back within 2 months to show that he'd restored harmony to his household. If not, the court threatened to intervene more directly, whatever that meant. Let's just say it probably didn't involve flowers and a candle-lit dinner. Fringe cases went even further. There's one where a woman claimed her husband had never once come to her bed in over a year of marriage. The court, after much debate, annulled the marriage completely. It was ruled invalid on the grounds of non-consummation, and the woman was free to remarry. Essentially, sex was the seal on the deal. No seal, no deal. Now, scholars still argue over how common these cases really were. Some believe they were rare, reserved for only the most extreme situations. Others argue that the records we do have exists. They were just the tip of the iceberg, that many more complaints were handled informally, through community pressure, or simply never documented. Regardless, the fact that anyone in Puritan society had to stand trial for having sex with their spouse tells you everything you need to know about their priorities. It's strange, right? We tend to think of the Puritans as the original sexual buzzkills, but here they were not only permitting sex, but enforcing it, actively policing it, dragging people into court because it wasn't happening. They didn't fear sex. They feared the absence of it, especially within marriage, where it was supposed to act like a kind of spiritual glue. And weirdly, this system wasn't just about punishment. Sometimes courts offered what we'd now call early marriage counseling. They'd bring in elders or ministers to encourage harmony, which is 17th century code for give you a talking to about foreplay. Not that the advice was always useful. Read scripture together, and then remember the warmth of Eden isn't textly setting, hearts racing, but still they were trying. Of course, all this assumed both spouses wanted intimacy, and just didn't know how to get there. It didn't always account for deeper issues like trauma, incompatibility, or abuse. Those things existed, but the Puritan framework wasn't built to handle them gently. The line between obligation and coercion could get real blurry, real fast, especially when courts were involved. But from their perspective, they were defending the sanctity of marriage. They believed that a sexless union was a ticking time bomb, one that could lead to infidelity, disorder, or worse. If fixing that meant dragging you into public shame, so be it. Better embarrassment than eternal damnation. So tonight, as you lie under your blankets, consider the strange comfort of not having to explain your sex life to a jury of church elders. You can turn off the lights without fearing a knock on the door from someone demanding updates on your benevolence. But back then, your bed wasn't just yours. It was communal property, sacred, scrutinized, and always subject to review. You're 16 years old, barely old enough to plow a straight furrow without supervision, and you've just been given permission to do something you never expected. Share a bed with your romantic interest before marriage, and not just for a stolen neighbor, a quick scandalous cuddle. You're actually encouraged to do this as part of courtship. Welcome to the strange world of Puritan bundling. It's not a phrase you're going to hear in many modern dating apps, but in colonial New England, bundling was a surprisingly common practice, especially in rural or deeply religious areas. And yes, it meant what it sounds like. To unmarried people, usually a courting couple, spending the night together in the same bed, sometimes with their clothes on, sometimes separated by a board or blanket barrier, and sometimes not so much. Now, to modern ears, this sounds like a disaster waiting to happen, but for the Puritans, especially among working-class families, bundling served a very practical and oddly spiritual purpose. Winter was long and cold, and most homes were small. If a suitor had walked or ridden hours through snow and wind to visit his beloved, it made sense for him to stay the night, but instead of crashing in the barn or curling up near the hearth, he'd be invited to share her bed, with supervision, of course, in theory. The idea was that bundling allowed young couples to get to know each other emotionally, conversationally, sometimes even physically, without actually having sex. Think of it like sanctioned intimacy, under extreme constraints. The goal wasn't necessarily to test compatibility in the modern sense, but to deepen the relationship through proximity and a kind of socially approved temptation resistance boot camp. Here's the fringe detail. Some couples were literally sewn into sacks. Yep. Parents or housekeepers would tie the girl into a bundling bag, a kind of cloth cocoon, before allowing the boy into bed beside her. The theory was that he could whisper sweet nothings, maybe hold hands through the fabric, but not go any further. Some families even placed a solid wooden board, called a bundling board place, of between them. It was the colonial version of a dating chaperone, only instead of watching from the corner, the board just sat resolently judging. Now, how well this worked is up for debate. Historical records suggest that bundling had wildly inconsistent results. In many cases, couples behaved themselves. They talked, maybe kissed a bit, and then went on to marry within months. But in plenty of other cases, things got, well, less chaste. There's unnotable uptick in hasty marriages about 9 months after these winter bundling seasons. Some Puritan communities even adjusted their calendars for weddings accordingly. Nothing like a June ceremony to celebrate a February bundling session gone a little too well. There's a particularly juicy account from western Massachusetts in 1678, where a young woman named Thankful, yes, that was her name, was bundled with her suitor, a farmer's apprentice. Despotial safeguards, Thankful became pregnant. The couple was forced to marry quickly, but their community still punished them both with public confession and temporary banishment from communion. Their bundling had failed the temptation test, and they paid for it. Though, to be fair, they also stayed married for 41 years. So maybe it wasn't a failure after all. This is where the scholarly debate really kicks in. Some researchers argue that bundling was a genuine attempt at promoting modest intimacy in an era without privacy. Others claim it was just performative, a wink and nod, cultural loophole that let young people explore physical desire under the guise of righteousness. Were communities really shocked when bundling led to pregnancy? Or did they kind of expect it and just go through the motions of scolding afterward? Historians are still split, and remember, not every parent allowed it. Wealthier families tended to avoid bundling, preferring chaperoned visits in drawing rooms, or if they were especially cautious, letters exchanged through mutual acquaintances. But among the laboring class, where beds were few, and winters brutal, bundling was just efficient. It allowed a suitor to stay without scandal, at least officially, and gave young lovers the closest thing to privacy they could ever hope to get. There's a weirdly endearing side to it, though. Imagine lying under a mountain of quilts, talking quietly in the dark to the person you hope to marry. There's no TV, no smartphones, no distractions, just breath and voice, the creak of the frame, and maybe the occasional nervous giggle. For all its awkward constraints, bundling created space for emotional connection, for curiosity, and for a kind of youthful romance that feels incredibly human. But the community always loomed large. If things went too far, consequences came fast. Public shame, forced marriage, exclusion from the church. It wasn't just your mistake. It was a moral failing that had to be corrected before the rock could spread. That's how seriously they took it. Yet, bundling didn't die out quickly. In some New England communities, it lasted well into the 18th century. Over time, it evolved. Less literal sack stitching, more coded expectations, but the concept endured. Closeness with rules, intimacy with oversight, the sort of you can touch, but only if the board says it's okay system. So, as you drift off tonight, picture yourself bundled up in every possible sense, wrapped in thick wool, tied into moral fabric, and wedged between the tension of desire and it's snowing outside. Your breath hangs in the air, and your future spouse is inches away, separated by a wooden board and a world of expectations. You want to reach across, but you're not sure if your hand will find fingers or a cold rebuke. Either way, the moment is real, and in that flickering candle, it hush. Even Puritans knew that longing was its own kind of grace. It's your second winter, bundling with the same suitor. And now it's starting to feel a little less like spiritual training, and a little more like a long, slow tease with a wooden board in the way. You've memorized the shape of his face by candlelight, the rustle of his breath against the straw-studded mattress, the way he shifts ever so slightly closer with each visit. You've talked about everything: his father's sick cow, the wheat prices, your favorite psalm, and sometimes then not so holy stirrings that come in the long pauses between subjects. You're both bundled like sausages, separated by a barrier, and still somehow more aware of each other's bodies than ever. But here's the twist most people don't expect. Even though bundling was supposed to discourage sex before marriage, it often encouraged emotional closeness and even physical affection. And as marriage approached, the expectation shifted again, because now, you weren't just being prepared for married life. You were being monitored for your progress toward it. In some towns, bundling with intent to marry was a recognized phase of courtship. Parents permitted it, ministers tolerated it, and entire households rearranged themselves to give the young couple some version of privacy. Thin, tentative épreuve, but privacy nonetheless. It wasn't unusual for siblings to sleep in the next room while a courting couple bundled in the main bed. Doors were rarely locked, but everyone knew that if the courting couple stayed up whispering past midnight, that was, well, a good sign. Here's a fun and slightly uncomfortable detail. Some families actually timed their children's bundling visits to coincide with certain phases of the moon, believing that full moons made temptation harder to resist. So, If the waxing gibbous was shining too bright, bundling might be delayed until the skies were a little more spiritually forgiving. It's hard to say if anyone aerially believed lunar light increased lust, but the folklore persisted. It's a kind of celestial chaperone, I guess. Now, let's talk about the plank, the infamous bundling board. Some people still think of it as a literal wooden divider that separated young lovers like a Puritan chastity force field. And yes, sometimes it really was that, a rough-sawn piece of pine laid between two bodies to say, this far, no farther. But in many cases it was more symbolic than structural. A heavy blanket, a rolled-up sheepskin, even a pillow, sewn down the middle of the bed. It gave the appearance of restraint, even if restraint was wearing very thin. By the time your wedding date is set, everyone in town assumes the bundling is over, or at least nearly so. Now you're supposed to be focusing on preparing your heart and household. But the reality, many couples kept bundling depth to the night before the wedding, and by that point, the lines between physical and spiritual readiness were very, very blurry. Some ministers turned a blind eye, others warned sternly about crossing into sin. But as long as no one showed visible signs of transgression, bundling's gray area remained intact. Still, plenty of couples crossed that line, and the evidence showed up just about 9 months later. Pre-wedding pregnancies were common enough that some New England towns kept meticulous records of childbirth dates and wedding anniversaries. Not for fun, but for accountability. If your baby arrived too early, you might be subject to fines, forced confession, or in some cases, full excommunication. One notorious example comes from New Hampshire in 1683. A woman named Deliverance, yep, another amazing Puritan name, gave birth 6 months after her wedding. She swore up and down it was a premature labor. Her husband backed her up, but the math wasn't adding up for the town elders. After asmal inquiry, they ruled that bundling had gone too far, and forced the couple to kneel in front of the congregation and publicly confess their fornication. Deliverance later wrote in her diary that the shame was a colder thing than snow upon the neck. Ouch. Still, not everyone was scandalized by bundling's filers. Some communities accepted it as a kind of moral speed bump. At least he married, was the unspoken rule. As long as things ended in a stable household, the bundling indiscretion was quietly folded into the bigger picture of Puritan survival and growth. And here's where things get really interesting for historians. There's an ongoing debate about whether bundling was genuinely accepted or merely tolerated. Was it a clever culturally sanctioned loophole, or a risky concession to practicality? Some scholars say it was a moral test designed to teach young people the value of restraint before unleashing their full physical selves in marriage. Others argue it was a pragmatic recognition that hormones exist, and it's better to manage them with structure than pretend purity will win every time. In either case, bundling left its mark, both literally and figuratively. Fringe rumors whispered of couples who took bundling to absurd lengths. Stories circulated of boys bribing their sweethearts, siblings to look away or sneak them food to keep the conversation and other activities going all night. In a few wild cases, someone even faked a bundling board by stuffing an old cloak with straw and sliding it into the bed while the real one, mysterious. These stories blur the line between myth and reality, but they reveal a persistent truth. Young love finds a way, even in a culture built on fences. So tonight, picture yourself endled up once more. The straw mattress cacks under you and your breath. CURLS inth, icy air. Across the board, real or not, is someone whose foot just brushed yours under the quilts. You're supposed to talk about the Psalms, or maybe the weather, but instead you both fall into a comfortable silence. A kind of silence that pulses with awareness. Maybe the moon is full, maybe you're thinking about tomorrow, and maybe, just maybe, you both know this bundling session won't last much longer. You've made it. The wedding's done. The awkward handshakes are over. and the cheese pie from the reception is sitting somewhere in your gut, like a small cannonball. Now, as the guests trickle home and the lanterns burn lower, the unspoken tension builds. It's wedding night. Yuckle into bed, maybe for the 100th time, if you were bundling, maybe for the first, and the room feels colder than usual. Not from the fire, but from the weight of expectation. Because while Puritan society might best and frown heavy, it also believes you two should be having sex tonight and regularly from now on. This is where things get beautifully, awkwardly real. For all their rules and scoldings and obsession with sin, Puritans didn't believe sex was inherently bad. In fact, within marriage, it was considered one of God's gifts, something to be embraced and enjoyed. Passion wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged, but not passion for its own sake. Passion in service of unity, duty, and divine order. Sexy, not exactly, but meaningful. Oh yes, you and your new spouse, may be still in your finest linen, or half out of it, are expected not just to consummate the marriage, but to continue doing so often and with intention. This isn't a Oniandan performance. Toprov, the deed is done, is the beginning of a lifelong habit, an act of spiritual maintenance, as well as your friends, your family, your pastor. They all assume that from this day forward, sex will be a regular part of your household rhythm. Miss a few nights, and people will start whispering. Miss a few weeks, and someone might send the deacon over, with a stern look and a well-worn Bible. Now, harissa, historical twist, most people miss. Sex was not just permitted, it was seen as healing. Some ministers wrote of sex as a comfort during illness, a balm for grief, and a way to restore the bonds of harmony after quarrels. It wasn't just about reproduction, it was about affection, reconciliation, and, believe it or not, pleasure within marriage. That is one minister. William Googe, yes, that guy again, wrote extensively about spouses should enjoy each other without sin, without shame. He even noted that mutual delight was a divine design. That 1600s Puritans speak for go ahead and like it. Shocking, right? We tend to imagine these people as buttoned-up fun killers. But when it came to married sex, they were more like slightly uncomfortable relationship coaches who also ran the local militia. And this belief had legal backing, too. There are court records where couples who failed to consummate their marriage were investigated, and in some cases had their unions annulled. It wasn't enough to get married, you had to seal the deal. Without sex, the covenant wasn't considered spiritually or socially complete. It was like buying a plow, but never taking it into the field. The whole point was to till the earth, and in this case, start making babies. Still, not every couple hit the ground running. Some took time, some struggled. And here's where the open scholarly debate comes in. How much pressure did Puritan couples actually feel to perform right away? And how did they deal with early issues, like nerves, inexperience, or disinterest? The records don't say much because no one wanted to admit those things in writing. But scattered diary entries and second-hand accounts suggest that early stumbles were more common than people let on, and sometimes newlyweds would bring their questions straight to their ministers. Imagine that for a second. You're 3 nights into your marriage, and unsure how it's all supposed to work, so you go ask your pastor and thepaster, in turn might reference scripture, offer moral encouragement, and sometimes, if he was particularly bold, give practical advice. There are even preserved sermons where ministers described what they called right ordering the marriage. Bed using metaphors so awkward they could double as euphemisms in a middle school health textbook. On the fringe side, there were whispers never officially recorded of certain wise women or older relatives offering more grounded advice. These were usually widows or midwives, women who understood the physical realities behind the theological curtain. They might warn a nervous bride about what to expect, or remind a jittery groom that gentleness was more godly than pride. These quiet, Voices probably did more for healthy marriages than all the bundled pamphlets and stern warnings combined. Still, some Puritan couples embraced this part of their marriage wholeheartedly. Letters from husbands to absent wives include phrases like, "I miss the warmth of thee," "the comfort of thy nearness." That's Puritan code for "I miss your body next to mine." And yes, it's as tender as it sounds. They were humans, after all. They worried, hoped, loved, and sometimes just wanted to feel skin on skin after a long day of survival. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Couples were also taught to be vigilant against excess, even within marriage. Too much passion, too much fixation, even too much physical pleasure could be seen as flesh ruling spirit. The idea wasn't to suppress enjoyment, but to balance it. If your marital sex life became obsessive or pulled you away from God, it was a problem. Ministers might gently remind couples not to let the marriage bed become a den of idolatry. Basically, have sex, enjoy it, but don't enjoy it too much. Try figuring out where that line is when you're newly married, sleep deprived, and in your own cabin. So, as you lie in bed, heart racing with a mix of anticipation and frostbite, your spouse beside you under woolen layers that feel 10 times too heavy, remember this. Puritans didn't just tolerate sex, they cherished it when it was within bounds, when it was mutual, and when it reinforced the sacred knot between two sides. And if it made your cheeks red the next day, well, that was just part of being blessed. You wake up to the sound of your neighbor in labor. She's 2 houses over, but the sharp low groans carry across the quiet morning like they're right outside your door. Childbirth isn't a private affair here. It's communal, messy, and deeply tied to the rhythms of Puritan life, especially for women. And whether you're the one giving birth or boiling linens next to the fire, you're part of a sacred and very physical ritual, one where modesty is expected, pain is guaranteed, and sex, strangely, lingers in the background like a silent witness to the whole affair. See, childbirth in the Puritan world was more than just biology. It was a divine confirmation that a marriage was functioning. Sex was the seed, birth the bloom, and the whole town kept track of your garden. A woman's fertility was seen as both her blessing and her burden. To carry, bear, and raise children was central to her identity, not just socially, but spiritually. The act of giving birth wasn't just labor, it was sanctification through suffering, and it wasn't done alone. When labor began, the men were usually banished from the house, often sent off to tend the fields, or, more usefully, fetch the midwife. From then, the space transformed into a female world. Mothers, sisters, neighbors, and midwives gathered, lighting candles, whispering psalms, boiling water, and preparing herbs. It wasn't clinical. It was warm, crowded, raw, and more than a little chaotic. The midwife was the star of the show. She wasn't just delivering the baby. She was managing the emotions of the room, watching for complications, and sometimes keeping secrets. Because if a labor started suspiciously early after a wedding, or involved a woman not known to be married at all, questions would start flying, not loudly, but quietly, sharply, and they always reached the elders by sunrise. Despite the religious framework, most women knew a surprising amount about sex androproduction. Maybe not in the anatomically precise textbook way we're used to, but they were no strangers. Tough, practical realities. Midwives passed down knowledge like heirloom recipes, how to ease pain with crushed mint and valerian root, how to reposition a stubborn baby, how to read the mother's body and breath. They also passed along more private knowledge, how to prevent pregnancy with dubious folk methods, how to recover intimacy after tearing, and how to approach sex again when the scars, both literal and emotional, were still fresh. Still, modesty was the law of the land, even in these most immodest of moments. During labor, women were typically kept under heavy linen sheets or woolen blankets. sometimes to the point of near suffocation. It wasn't for warmth, it was for decency. It's a surreal image. A woman screaming through contractions, her face drenched in sweat, while her body remains mostly hidden under layers of fabric. The baby might arrive in near darkness, guided by the hands of a midwife, working by touch alone, because seeing too much even during birth was considered morally risky. It didn't always go well, of course. In fact, childbirth was terrifying. The odds of dying from complications were high, and nearly every woman went into labor, knowing who hadn't come out of it. There were no real painkillers, no trained doctors in the modern sense, and no It was common for a woman to say her goodbyes before going into labor, to have her will ready, and to confess her sins with trembling lips in case this was the end. And still, women bore child after child, sometimes 10, 12, even 15. It was expected, a sign of spiritual health. A woman who couldn't conceive, or who had repeated stillbirths, was often prayed for, or occasionally suspected of hidden sin. And if your husband was a man of standing, you could be under even more pressure, because in the Puritan equation, marriage equals sex equals children equals divine favor. Disrupt that flow, and the whole system shivered. There's an open scholarly debate here. Just how much agency did women really have in these intensely reproductive lives? Some argue they were nothing more than wombs in service of theology, shuttled from pregnancy to pregnancy until their bodies gave out. Others point to midwifery records, personal diaries, and whispered letters that show women carving out spaces of resistance, choosing their partners, learning to control their cycles, even refusing to go through another childbirth by quietly withholding sex. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Women caught in a tight web of expectation, but still tugging at the threads when they could. A fascinating fringe detail. There's at least one colonial record of a midwife being reprimanded, not for mishandling a birth, but for talking too openly about how babies are made. Apparently, she gave a young wife unbending advice about how to enjoy sex and position herself for easier conception. The community elders thought this was too worldly, too close to the edge of propriety. But the wife notably had no complaints. And yes, there were cases where intimacy never resumed after childbirth. Sometimes from fear, sometimes from trauma, sometimes because the body simply wouldn't cooperate. But when that happened, it wasn't left as acute grief between partners. It became again a matter of concern. If the marital bed went cold, the suspicion was that sin or pride had crept in. Neighbors would whisper, ministers might intervene, and if one spouse complained, the courts could once more get involved. So, as the baby's cry pierces the morning, and the women begin to clean up the afterbirth, you sit back and marvel at how closely sex, love, pain, and faith are woven together in this world. In the Puritan home, every moan in the night, every swelling belly, every cry of a newborn is a reminder. Sex is. It echoes through the halls, through the town, through the theologitzif, and somewhere beneath all the layers of cloth, of expectation, often, is a very human yearning for connection that refuses to be silenced. The pulpit cacks slightly as he leans forward. His voice, calm but deliberate, reaches the back rows of the meeting house like a fishing line tossed over a still pond. Let no man be deceived by the outward appearance of holiness, if inward lust rots the soul. The congregation shifts. Someone coughs. You try not to look at your spouse, but everyone's thinking the same thing. Reverend Shaw is talking about sex again, and this time it's not abstract. It's personal, because everyone knows what happened last week behind the personage, and tonight's sermon is either a rebuke or a public confession in disguise. See, while Puritan ministers were quick to preach restraint and discipline, they weren't immune to temptation. Some of them preached one thing and practiced another, and when they slipped, it shook the community. Not just because of the sin, but the hypocrisy. In a society that demanded purity from its leaders, a minister caught in a sexual scandal was like a barn on fire. Everyone ran to watch, to gossip, and to ask themselves how deep the rot really went. You'll remember the first time you heard the whispers. It wasn't even about your own minister. It was a scandal from another town, one that trickled down through traders and peddlers, and gossip carried in folded letters. A clergyman had been found alone with a married woman at dusk, no less. They were just praying, according to his statement, but the window had been open, and someone had seen a hand where it didn't belong. The fallout was swift. Excommunication, public confession, and for the woman, a permanent stain on her reputation. Who was sent back to England? She was sent to sit in the church's shame bench week after week. This wasn't an isolated case. Several ministers were caught in compromising positions across New England, some more dramatic than others. One famously tried to escape punishment by claiming he'd been under demonic attack, that Satan had tempted him with spirit of carnal desire. It didn't work. He lost his position and his wife, and left town in disgrace. And yet, there was a weird paradox at play. Because Puritan ministers weren't just theologians. They were marriage counselors, sex educators, and moral referees, all rolled into one. They performed weddings, heard confessions, settled disputes, and at times literally told couples how often they should be having sex. They quoted Corinthians and Solomon with ease, interpreting scripture into weekly expectations. So, when one of them broke those same rules, it didn't just damage a family, it rattled the entire theological framework. The scholarly debate here is layered. Some historians argue that these ministers were victims of their own impossible standards. They were men asked to be more than men, perfect symbols of virtue, in a world that didn't leave much space for honest human struggle. Others take a harsher view thought. These men used their authority to manipulate, seduce, or coerce, hiding behind scripture to justify what amounted to abuse. The truth, again, is likely both, and somewhere in the middle, we find the messy humanity. Puritans tried so hard to tidy up. Let's not pretend these sermons weren't intense. Ministers used powerful imagery to drive home their warnings. Lust was called a creeping rot of the flesh. Adultery was a death of the covenant, and sex outside of marriage, that was soul poison. But then sometimes a line would slip in that caught your ear. Let not the marriage bed be cold, nor joyless. And you'd realize that, despite all the fire and brimstone, these men did believe in affection, in pleasure, in physical closeness, as something good as long as it stayed in bounds. But that's what made their failures hit so hard. When they stepped out of a line, when a married minister was caught in the arms of a servant, or when a visiting preacher was seen leaving a widow's house after dark, it wasn't just sin, it was betrayal. Because in Puritan society, the minister was the embodiment of sexual order, and if he couldn't uphold it, what did that mean for the rest of the flock? And yet, the community didn't always respond the same way. In one case in Connecticut, a young minister was caught in what the records call inappropriate familiarity with his housemaid. He confessed, cried publicly, and resigned. But instead of shunning him entirely, the town wrote to a neighboring church and recommended him for reassignment. Hester did fresh, a few miles away, with a new congregation and presumably a more secure bedroom door. Was it forgiveness? Was it denial? Was it just damage control? Fringe stories tell of ministers how went even further off the rails. One was rumored to have kept a journal detailing his carnal visits with multiple parishioners. That journal, if it ever existed, vanished after his death. Some believe it was burned by his widow. Others think the elders destroyed it to preserve the town's fragile moral fabric. Either way, the story still circulates in footnotes and folklore. Despite all this, most ministers remained deeply committed to the roles. They genuinely tried to guide their congregations through the difficult terrain of marriage and sexuality. Many were good husbands, attentive fathers, and fierce defenders saw of their communities. And yes, many also gave private counsel to struggling couples, helping them reconnect or recover after years of distance. Some were even surprisingly modern in their advice, emphasizing mutual respect and emotional transparency, though wrapped in King James English, of course. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine this silhouette of a minister at his writing desk, candle flickering, scribbling sermon notes about temptation while wrestling with his own. Picture the pulpit as both a pedestal and a trap, one that elevates and exposes at the same time. And remember, even the holiest voices sometimes faltered in the quiet hours after the last hymn. Because Puritans weren't perfect. They were human, messy, yearning, and deeply aware of the fire that burned between duty and the baby doesn't cry, not right away. The room, which was filled just moments ago with strained breath and whispered psalms, turns to silence, cold, awful silence. The midwife swaddles the small, still form while the mother, drenched in sweat and trembling, waits for a sound that doesn't come. Outside, snow gathers on the eaves, and the firewood pops in the hearth. But inside this tiny house, the air is frozen. This is the quiet Puritans feared most, because in this world, fertility is hope, but childbirth is Russian roulette. You already know sex was seen as a divine duty. And for the Puritans, so was its natural consequence, children. To have a large family was considered a sign of spiritual favor and communal success. But every pregnancy came bundled with terror, and every act of intimacy, no matter how tender or joyous, carried the possibility of death. It's hard to grasp just how common loss was in the 1600s. Infant mortality rates were brutal, with roughly 1 in 4 babies dying before their first birthday. For mothers, it wasn't much better. Complications, hemorrhaging, fever, all potentially fatal, in a world with no antibiotics, no anesthesia, and midwives, working mostly by touch and instinct. You didn't just risk your body in childbirth, you risked your soul. And yet, time after time, couples returned to the marriage bed, driven by duty, belief, and sometimes sheer resilience. It wasn't about pleasure anymore. Not fully. It was about trying again, rebuilding, rehoping. You lose a child and you grieve, yes, but then you try again. Because trying again means life goes on. Trying again means maybe this time you'll get to keep what's been taken. This repeated loss didn't just wound, it changed people. Women especially bore the emotional fallout in silence. Diaries speak of melancholy, wasting spirits, and spiritual exhaustion. These aren't just quaint phrases. They're the raw vocabulary after repression, but the expectation was always the same. Pray, endure, and return to your duties. A scholar Mitarg, and many do, that Puritan women were conditioned to accept this suffering as part of their divine role. Some historians call it the theology of affliction, the belief that suffering purifies, and that grief draws you closer to God. That belief helped some women survive unfathomable losses. Others were crushed by it. And still, sex remained at the center of it all, the beginning of joy and sorrow alike. On a particularly haunting entry from a 1647 diary simply reads, "The babe did not breathe. My husband sat in silence. We held each other, but did not speak. That night, he came to my bed again, and I did not say no." There's no romance in that line, but there's something else, something raw and unflinching. Grief and intimacy tangled together, as they often were in Puritan life. And then there's the other kind of fear, not being able to conceive at all. For a woman in a Puritan colony, barrenness was a heavy stigma. A childless wife might be pied at best, suspected at worst. Perhaps she was too proud, too cold, too sinful. Maybe God had closed her womb for a reason. These whispers weren't just cruel, they were dangerous. Because if your husband believed them, he might petition for divorce or seek out another woman, in secret. Not every man did, but pressure was real. Men weren't immune to suspicion either. If a couple went years without children, someone would inevitably ask whether the husband was strong of seed. A few brave souls even took these concerns to court, claiming their spouse was unfit for procreation or cold in nature. This could spark humiliating public inquiries. In one fringe case from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a husband was ordered to prove his potency. How exactly is left tactfully vague in their accord, but you can imagine how well that went. And all of this leads to a tension that pulsed under the surface of every Puritan bedroom. Sex was supposed to be sacred, but it was also terrifying. It brought life and death, hope and heartbreak. It was duty, desire, and danger wrapped in scratchy linen and the glow of a dying fire. Despite that, many couples found their own rhythm in the chaos. They weren't just surviving, they were adapting. Some husbands delayed intimacy after chilled birth, waiting longer than the expected 6 weeks, letting their wives heal. Some women, weary from grief, refused their husbands gently but firmly, and some men, bless them, respected that. Those small gestures didn't always show up in records, but they existed. You can feel them in the margins of old letters, and in the pause between diary entries. A husband writes, "She sleeps much, and eats little. I hold her hand. I speak softly to her." That's not theology, that's love. Still, no matter how careful you were, the expectation loomed. Try again. Get back in bed. Fulfill your covenant. Every act of intimacy might be the start of something new, or the next in a string of heartbreaks. And yet, there's something powerful in that repeated willingness to hope. Something that defies the cold, clinical way we often talk about Puritans. They weren't just duty-driven automatons. They were people navigating a world where sex was both sacred act and existential gamble. So tonight, ask wind whistles against your window pane and the fire hums in the grate. Think about the strength it took to love Samin under those conditions. To reach out across the sheets, knowing what might come. To try again and again and again. Not because it was easy, but because in that fragile flicker of connection there was life, and that in all its quiet defiance was holiness. The water's cold, cold enough to bite your fingers and sting your skin. But you're used to it. Bathing isn't a daily thing here, not even weekly for most. The town well is a good walk. Firewood is precious, and let's be honest, there's just not enough time between childbirths, sermons, and scrubbing out chamber pots to fuss over cleanliness, which means that for most Puritans, nakedness was rare, really rare. And because it was rare, it became electrified, not sinful necessarily, but charged. In this world where even undressing was often done in semi-darkness and under layers, the human body became a mysterious, almost forbidden frontier. You're standing behind a threadbare curtain, with your shift bunched around your knees, trying to splash enough water over yourself to feel possibly clean without catching cold. Your spouse walks in unexpectedly, not that there's really anywhere else to walk in a one-room home, and for a second, you both freeze. There's no scream, no panic, but the weight of seeing skin in daylight hits like a sudden storm. This isn't scandalous. It's intimate in a way that feels almost unbearable. You're not just undressed, you're exposed. That's the strange truth about Puritan sexuality. Modesty didn't suppress desire, it intensified it. In a society where clothing was functional, layered, and never optional, even a glimpse of ankle could carry a charge. The bedroom wasn't just where sex happened. It was one of the only places where you might see each other fully, literally uncovered, which made those moments feel sacred, surreal, and sometimes overwhelming. Bathing together, not come on, but it did happen, especially among newlyweds, or in homes with only one tub and little privacy. There's a reference in one 1670s diary to a husband who warmed the water for my wash and lingered while I stood therein. That's as much detail as she gives, but the undertone is clear. There's tenderness, curiosity, maybe even flirtation, and it's all wrapped up in steam and shyness. What's more, the scarcity of skin made physical affection, when it finally happened, intensely powerful. For some Puritan couples, removing clothes wasn't just a practical step toward intimacy. It was a ritual, layer by layer, shift by shift, like peeling back the armor of a harsh world. The beneath was not just flesh, it was a revelation, a testament to trust. You didn't see your spouse naked in passing. You saw them intentionally, as part of a private covenant. And that made it different from anything else in your day-to-day life. Of course, not everyone romanticized it. Some found it embarrassing or even terrifying, especially for young brides who'd never seen a naked man or much of anyone else really. You grew up in households where modesty was law, where your body was rarely acknowledged and never discussed in affectionate terms. To be suddenly expected to undress and enjoy someone else's undressing, that could feel jarring, disorienting. Wonder many early marriages stumbled through the first months of intimacy like children fumbling in the dark. Here's the fringe fact for tonight. Some Puritans believed that washing too often could invite lust. Clean skin felt soft, smelled sweet, and in their view, might tempt your spouse, or worse, someone else's spouse, into sinful thoughts. A few religious writers even warned against overbathing, claiming it was vain, indulgent, and potentially dangerous to one's spiritual focus. So cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was next to temptation. A risky, slippery slope, if you will, which leads us to the debate among historians. Did Puritan modesty repress sexuality, or did it amplify it? On one hand, you've got rules. On top of rules, no public kissing, no suggestive dress, and absolutely no nudity outside of necessity. On the other, you've got sermons celebrating marital sex, court cases defending a wife's right to intimacy, and diary entries dripping with. The tension between public piety and private passion is where Puritan life really gets interesting. It wasn't about suppressing sex. It was about fencing it in so it burned hotter inside. Some letters from the period are astonishing in their raw affection. A husband writes, "I long for the sight of thy bare shoulders, as I long for thee of spring." That's not exactly raunchy, but it's tender, poetic, and soaked with yearning. And in a time when Evan's shoulders were kept under lock and key, that longing wasn't trivial. It was everything. And in homes where bathtubs were rare, and shared space even rarer, any moment of semi-nakedness was immediately intimate. Slipping off your stockings to warm your feet by the fire, lifting your chemise to treat a fever, buttoning up your spouse's shirt while he shivered. These moments weren't always sexual, but they were loaded with awareness. Tiny rituals that stitched into the fabric of everyday life. Of course, not everyone handled the intensity well. Some couples, unable to reconcile spiritual modesty with physical desire, struggled to even look at each other during intimacy. There are accounts, heartbreaking, frankly, of couples who lived together for years, raising children, sharing beds, but never once saw each other fully nude. Sex happened under covers in darkness, with clothes hastily pulled aside, and shame curling in afterward like smoke. That wasn't uncommon, and it wasn't always unhappy, but it does show how deeply modesty could shape even the most personal experiences. So, tonight, as you fold yourself into bed, imagine shedding a woolen layer in a room lit only by firelight. Imagine the quiet inhale of breath as you reveal an elbow, a collarbone, the small curve of your hip. Your spouse looks not with lust but with awe, not because your body is perfect, but because it's yours. And because in a world where skin is sacred and silence is golden, your nakedness is not a loss of decency. It's a kind of trust, a kind of worship. It's been a few months. Now, you and your spouse are sleeping back to back, more often than not. The fire burns low, and the quiet has grown heavy. Not the comforting kind that lets you drift off, but but the strange hollow silence of something missing. You're tired, both of you, and it's not just from hauling water or tending fields. There's something deeper at the seams of your marriage, and, eventually, it becomes impossible to ignore. So, you do thinkable, the thing most people in your situation only whisper about. You consider divorce. And in Puritan New England, that wasn't just about failing emotionally. If you weren't having sex, it could be legal grounds to end your marriage. Yes, you read that right. The Puritans, those buttoned-up champions of rigid family values, actually permitted divorce, and they did so more often than people think, but not for just anything. Not for boredom or irreconcilable deference, or because your spouse snored loud enough to shake the roof beams. Divorce was rare, but if you had a legitimate grievance, especially one that violated the marriage covenant, the court would listen. And chief among those grievances, failure to perform conjugal duty. If one spouse refused intimacy without cause, be it from cruelty, disinterest, or just plain stubbornness, that was seen as a betrayal of the vows. You couldn't just ignore your partner and expect to keep the marriage intact. The physical bond, a side dish to Puritan matrimony, it was the main course spiritually and legally. Sex wasn't just an expression of love, it was the cement of the union. If that cement never dried or if it cracked beyond repair, the whole structure was considered unstable. One documented case from the 1670s, Boston, tells of a man who petitioned for divorce after 2 years of marriage. His wife, he claimed, had never come willingly to the bed. Witnesses were called, not just the couple, but neighbors, midwives, even an unlucky sister-in-law who had overheard too much through the wall. After a lengthy deliberation, the court dissolved the marriage, declaring that it had never been properly fulfilled. That's right, no sex, no marriage. It wasn't always men filing either. There are records of women initiating divorce for the exact same reason. One wife in Plymouth accused her husband of neglect, citing not just his absence from her bed, but his refusal to even share meals with her. She testified that he shunned her like a ghost, and that no child had come of their union because he would not draw near. The court ruled in her favor. The marriage was declared void, and she was allowed to remarry. Still, the process wasn't easy. Divorce required public hearings, sworn testimony, and often humiliating levels of detail. Imagine having to stand in front of a magistrate and explain that your husband, yes, him sitting right there with arms crossed, hasn't touched you since last spring, but every night he turns away, mumbles aporia, and falls asleep before you even finish unlacing your bodice. It's mortifying, but it's also your only way out. Now, this brings up an ongoing scholarly debate. Were Puritans progressive in their approach to marriage law, or simply controlling? Some argue that by allowing divorce for lack of intimacy, they were acknowledging the importance of emotional and physical health within a marriage. Others say this was just another tool of surveillance, another way to police behavior and enforce conformity. After all, the courts weren't exactly warm and fuzzy. They weren't guiding couples toward healing. They weren't guiding verdicts, and those verdicts could be brutal. In one fringe case, from the Connecticut, a man who had failed to consummate his marriage due to what the record called natural deficiency, was publicly examined. Yes, physically examined by appointed officials. When it was deemed he could not fulfill his duties, the court annulled the marriage. The woman who had brought the complaint was praised for her honesty. Meanwhile left the town under a cloud of disgrace and endless snickering. So yes, the Puritans took the bedroom seriously. It wasn't a private playground. It was a civic institution. A malfunctioning sex life wasn't just a disappointment. It was a legal vulnerability. And if things fell apart, the fallout didn't end with the marriage. Divorced individuals often carried a social stain, especially women. Even if the court ruled in your favor, the whispers would follow you. She must be cold. He must be broken. They must have sinned. Despite this, Some divorces found new beginnings. Remarriage was permitted, and even encouraged in some cases, particularly if children were involved, or if the community saw the individual still useful in the colony. One divorced woman in Salem remarried within 6 months, and went on to have 6 children. Her first husband, notably, moved west, and was never mentioned in town records again. Whether Hedda suffered in shame or simply preferred solitude is anyone's guess. Of course, many couples didn't go through with divorce. Even when intimacy faded, they stayed. They adapted. Some redefines their bond as partnership more than passion, leaning into shared chores, child-rearing, and quiet companionship. Others suffered in silence. And still others, perhaps the luckiest, found their way back to each other. After seasons of distance, something would soften. A touch on the shoulder, a murmured apology, the rekindling of a bed that had gone cold. So, as you settle in tonight, beside someone who maybe snores, or kicks, or forgets to say goodnight, think about what it means to choose connection again and again, even when it's hard. In Puritan life, sex was never just about desire. It was covenant, evidence, glue, and sometimes a quiet rebellion against loneliness. A good marriage wasn't perfect, but it was willing. And that was often the difference between staying together or standing in court, telling strangers why you no longer touch. The bell rings out across the village square, and even before the sound fades, people are gathering. It's not a celebration. This is a punishment, and Avarian knows it. Children clutch their mothers' aprons, men lean on their walking sticks, and somewhere in the crowd, you see your neighbor shaking her head in slow, grave disapproval. At the center of the square stands a wooden post, freshly scrubbed, the ropes hanging like silent accusations. Today, someone's going to be punished for adultery, and it's not going to be subtle. In Puritan New England, adultery wasn't just a private sin. It was a public scandal of the highest order. You weren't shamed in whispers. You were paraded, displayed, marked, because to betray the marriage covenant wasn't just to hurt your spouse. It was to undermine it, very structure of the godly society they believed they were building. And let's be clear, the punishments were stocks, whipping, fines, forced public confessions. In the earliest decades of settlement, adultery was even punishable by death. Yes, death. It didn't happen often. The colonies weren't exactly eager to shrink an already fragile population, but the law was on the books, and the threat hung heavy over every whispered affair or suspicious glance. One of the most infamous cases occurred in 1644, when Mary Lamb and James Britton were both executed for adultery in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Executed, as in hanged. Mary was just 16. Britton was much older and married. Their affair was discovered, confessed, and the punishment was swift. It shocked even some contemporaries and future. Puritan leaders later expressed discomfort with how harshly the case was handled, but at the time, the message was clear. Violate the sanctity of marriage and you risk everything. More commonly, adulterers were sentenced to stand in public wearing a letter sewn to their clothes. Sound familiar? Yes. This is where Nathaniel Hawthorne got his inspiration for the Scarlet Letter. Their life didn't glow red, but it was real, and it was devastating. It marked heads guilty, not just for a moment, but often for the rest of their lives. In some cases, the letter had to be worn for a year. In others, it was permanent, sewn into every garment. You couldn't leave the house without announcing your shame to the world. There was no disappearing into the crowd, no quiet reconciliation behind closed doors. If you were found guilty, you were named, blamed, and displayed. Your spouse might be ordered to stay with you for the sake of the children or the household, or they might be granted divorce. Either way, everyone knew, and in a town of 100 people, no one ever forgot. Of course, there were exceptions. Some offenders were spared harsh punishment, usually if they were wealthy, well-connected, or male. That's where hypocrisy creeps in. While both men and women were legally accountable for adultery, the social consequences often hit women harder. A man might remarry quickly, recover his standing, and then return to a position of leadership. A woman, she'd be lucky to avoid total social exile. That imbalance fuels ongoing debate among historians. Some argue that Puritan law treated both sexes equally, at least on paper. Others point to numerous cases where male offenders were let off lightly, while women bore the full brunt of community. The courts might have claimed impartiality, but the culture of blame was skewed, and women paid the higher price. One particularly fringe case involved a man who confessed to multiple affairs, but was spared public punishment after claiming spiritual weakness and begging forgiveness. His wife, meanwhile, was the one forced to wear the scarlet letter because she'd failed to satisfy him. That's not just unfair, that's medieval level. But not all communities were this cruel. Some couples rocked by betrayal found a way forward. There are court records and personal letters showing husbands and wives who chose to forgive, to rebuild, to start again. Sometimes for the children, sometimes out of duty, and sometimes, amazingly, out of love. In one letter from a wife to her arranged husband, she writes, "Though thou didst wound me, yet I find within my heart a softness that seeks thy return." That's Puritan poetry, stripped of artifice, soaked in heartbreak. Forgiveness, though, rarely erased the scar. Even after punishment was served, the stain lingered. If you had once worn thelator, or confessed in church, or stood tied to the stocks, while your neighbors passed by, you would always be that person. Every time you stepped into the meeting house, every time you asked to borrow salt, every time your children misbehaved, and someone muttered that sin follows sin, you carried the weight, and your spouse, if they stayed, carried it with you. And in some cases, adultery was more than desire. It was escape. Some Puritan women trapped in abusive or loveless marriages sought comfort elsewhere, not from lust, but from loneliness. Some men, feeling emasculated by infertility or public failure, chased affirmation in forbidden arms. These were complicated, messy, deeply human failings. But the Puritan system had no room for nuance. You were guilty or not, repentant or not, saved or dead. So tonight, picture the square once the crowd disperses. The rope swings lightly in the breeze. The letter still glows, not with embroidery, but with memory. Somewhere a man sits by cold hearth, wondering if he'll ever be seen as more than a mistake. Somewhere else, a woman folds a dress he'll never wear again, and somewhere a couple sits together in the darkness, unsure if they can begin again, both holding hands anyway, because Puritan justice was swift and public, but human forgiveness that was slower, quieter, and sometimes stronger. You're the back of the meeting house, avoiding eye contact, heart thudding beneath your plain wool coat. You've heard the sermon before, lots of times, but today the words hit differently. The minister is speaking about unnatural affections, his voice smooth and solemn, and as the congregation nods, you feel like the walls are inching closer. You know what he means. You've known for a while, and in Puritan New England, desires don't follow the narrow path. There's no off-ramp. There's only sin or silence. We tend to imagine the Puritans as having rigid ideas about sex, and that's true. But when it came to same-sex relationships, their rigidity hardened into full-blown terror. Any deviation from heterosexual, marital, reproduction-focused intimacy wasn't just frowned upon. It was criminal, and not just a fine or a public rebuke. Acts of sodomy or unnatural practices could be punished by death. No euphemisms here. The law was chillingly specific, and its message was clear. Step outside the prescribed bounds, and your life is forfeit. This fear wasn't theoretical. In 1646, William Plain of New Haven was executed for sodomy and other filthy practices. There's no detailed record of what exactly happened, just a public declaration of guilt and a swift sentence. He was hanged. No debate, no mercy, just a stark public example. Madiev, someone whose only crime, as far as we know, was loving, or perhaps merely desiring someone in the wrong way. But there's the thing. Desire doesn't vanish just because society demands it, and in the cracks between the rules, quiet rebellions took place. They had 2 letters written in careful coded language, glances exchanged too long at the well, walks in the woods that stretched a little past sundown, all Ophet whispered, hidden, impossible to name aloud, and yet utterly real. Some of the only clues we have come from court records, mostly accusations, which often lacked clear evidence, but were terrifying all the same. One man, John Knight, was accused of suspicious behavior with a servant boy. The case fell apart due to lack of proof, but the accusations stuck. He was watched. Whispers followed him. He eventually floofed town, whether he was guilty or not. His life unraveled because someone thought his affection looked wrong. Historians have to walk carefully through. It's part of the Puritan record because it's almost all written by people who condemned what they were describing. There are no love letters between men or women tucked safely into chibs. Only testimonies, confessions wrung from terrified people, and sermons full of thunder. But if you read between the lines, you find traces of real people, lonely, yearning, and often very brave. In a few rare diaries, phrases slip through that suggest emotional intimacy between same-sex friends, that bordered on romantic. I longed for his voice and his closeness. She placed her hand upon mine, and my heart trembled. Were these romantic, platonic, desperate attempts to describe something forbidden using the only words available? We don't know. But we do know that Puritan life left very little room for ambiguity. And if someone suspected your affections, that closeness could be your undoing. Women's same-sex relationships were more likely to be dismissed or ignored, unless caught in overt acts, which were harder to define and prosecute under the law. Still, there are scattered cases of women accused of lewd behavior, or unseemly familiarity with each other. The punishments were inconsistent. Some were fined, others publicly shamed, a few quietly removed from their communities. But the fear was just as real. Because even if the law couldn't always explain it, the Puritan worldview demanded order, and same-sex love didn't fit the plan. There's a fringe story, one that drifts into the realm of folklore, about 2 women in Colonial, Rhode Island, who lived together for years. One was widowed, the other never married. They kept house together, tended a small garden, and were referred to by neighbors as the sisters. Nothing about their relationship was ever written down formally, but their names appear next to each other, on tax rolls and supply lists for decades. Whether they were close friends or something more, we'll never know. But in a world of rigid binaries, sometimes survival meant blending in, holding back, and building something quiet that could pass for ordinary. And that raises one of the most pressing debates among scholars. Was there any room, any at all, for queer Puritans to live openly, even in subtle ways? Some argue no, that the theology and theological systems were too oppressive. Others suggest that small pockets of tolerance, or at least willful blindness, might have existed, especially in isolated settlements or among families willing to protect their own. But even if tolerance appeared, it came at a cost. Silence, self-erasure, a lifetime of watching your words and measuring your glances. Despite all this, people found each other. They always do. Even when the entire world tells them not to. Even when the risks are enormous, because longing doesn't respect borders, it slips past them. And somewhere in Puritan New England, 2 people may have held hands in the dark. Not because they were allowed to, but because they needed to. So tonight, picture a candle burning low in a window. 2 men sitting close but not touching, reading from the same page. 2 women sharing a bed under the pretext of friendship. one gently brushing the other's hair. No grand declarations, no confessions, just the quiet, stubborn truth of affection where it's not supposed to bloom, and the courage it takes to feel it anyway. The wind howls outside, rattling the shutters, and inside your candle burns low, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. Your spouse has been acting strangely, waking in the night, flushed and trembling, mumbling confessions under their breath. The neighbors have noticed, too. They say it's more than just exhaustion or melancholy. They say it's something darker. And by morning, someone dares to say the word aloud, witchcraft. Because in Puritan, New England, when something unexplained stirred beneath the skin, especially desire, it wasn't always seen as human. Sometimes it was blamed on the devil. And here's where things take a dramatic turn. Because while the Puritans were deeply religious and intensely rational in their own way, they were also profoundly superstitious, particularly when it came to matters of the flesh. They believed the devil was everywhere, in the woods, in the weather, and especially in the bedroom, and lust. That wasn't always your own doing. It could be a spell, a bewitching, a spiritual attack. It's easy to laugh now, imagining ministers waving Bibles at someone's libido. But to the Puritan mind, uncontrollable was dangerous and often unnatural. If a man found himself obsessed with a woman he wasn't Marietto, he might not blame temptation or his own wandering thoughts. He might say he'd been bewitched. There are actual testimonies, recorded in chilling detail, of men who claimed they were undone by a woman's glance, or felt a burning in the loins that could only be explained by magic. They described waking from dreams sticky with the devil's mark, convinced that Satan himself had visited them in the night, disguised as a lover. Women weren't spared this paranoia. If a woman became pregnant out of wedlock, Aravan simply acted in a way deemed too forward. She could be accused of using her body to seduce men, not as a sinner, but as an agent of Satan. Sometimes they were labeled succubi in petticoats, and it wasn't just poetic language. There were real trials where sexual behavior, or even just attractiveness, was used as evidence of witchcraft. One of the most famous cases is that of Sarah Good, one of the first women accused during the Salem witch trials. While her case was based mostly on her bad temper and idle lifestyle, there were undertones of moral suspicion, questions about her interactions with men, and whispered theories that she had dark powers to stir improper thoughts in others. And then there's Bridget Bishop, who was hanged for, among other things, wearing red. Her accusers claimed she appeared in their dreams, seducing them with wicked glee. The implication wasn't subtle. Female sexuality, especially outside the confines of marriage, was inherently suspect. If a woman had power over a man, real or imagined, that power couldn't possibly be hers. It had to come from the devil. This fear extended into marriage as well. If a couple suddenly began experiencing problems, sudden impotence, miscarriages, loss of affection, it wasn't unusual to hear whispers of a curse or a hex. One fringe case from Connecticut involved a man who claimed his new wife had enchanted his member, rendering him incapable. The court actually brought in a midwife to examine him and consulted a minister for spiritual guidance. The marriage was annulled. The woman, shamed and exiled, left the village in disgrace. The scholarly debate here is fascinating. Was this truly about belief or about control? Some historians argue that accusations of lust-fueled witchcraft were a way to punish women who didn't conform, those who were too beautiful, too independent, or too confident. Others point to the genuine terror that surrounded the devil's supposed influence, arguing that Puritans truly believed in a spiritual war playing out in bedrooms as much as in churches. Either way, the results were the same. Women, especially those connected to anything sexual, were vulnerable to deadly suspicion. Men, too, weren't immune. There are rare cases of men being accused of unnatural lust or having congress with dark spirits in the form of women who visited them in dreams. These stories often read like badly veiled admissions of sexual fantasy or guilt, but they were taken seriously. A man might be told to confess, repent, and undergo spiritual cleansing, sometimes including fasting, isolation, or public humiliation, because that devil wasn't just out there, he was in you. One haunting testimony comes from a young man who confessed to nightly dreams, in which a woman with black eyes and fire beneath her skirt climbed into his bed. He said he awoke, unable to breathe, drenched in sweat and heavy with sin. He swore she whispered in his ear, promising forbidden pleasures. Was it a wet dream? Elma certainly. But in his world, it was evidence of demonic seduction. And he wasn't punished for having the dream. He was praised for confessing and resisting. But what if he hadn't confessed? What if somebody else had seen his shame first? The Puritan fear of sex as sorcery wasn't just metaphorical. It shaped real laws, real punishments, and real tragedies. Sexuality outside of strict boundaries wasn't just rebellion. It was evidence of spiritual rot, and if you were suspected of being the cause, the punishment could range from ostracism to death. So tonight, picture a woman standing in a courtroom clutching her shawl, as the minister reads, from Leviticus. She's accused not just of sin, but of weaponizing desire. Her crime, her neighbor's husband said he dreamed of her naked and glowing. Her defense, silence. Because there is no defense when the fire in someone else's body gets pinned to your soul. The candle burns lower, the wind hisses against the window, and somewhere behind every trembling hand and stolen glance eyes, the knowledge that lust in Puritan New England wasn't just dangerous, it could be fatal. You're out splitting wood trying to stay focused, but your mind keeps drifting back to what the minister said last Sunday. He warned they owned men against idle hands and self-defilement, which is Puritan shorthand for what you've been doing in secret since you were 14. You don't even have a word for it. Not a clear one. Nobody does. They just call it sin or solitary vice, or if they're feeling dramatic, the sin that stains the soul from within, and suddenly your own body doesn't feel like it belongs to you anymore. Welcome to the Puritan moral panic over masturbation. That's right. Even though it rarely appeared in open court records, masturbation was very much on the Puritan radar. It wasn't just frowned upon, it was feared, considered a gateway to spiritual ruin, a perversion of natural desire, and a sign that the devil had crept into your most private moments. If adultery was a crime against your spouse, and fornication a crime against God, then self-pleasure, that was a crime against your very soul. Now, unlike adultery or fornication, masturbation was tricky to prosecute because, well, who